So we've had a look at the Great Plague, when the plague hit London with a vengeance in 1665, and we've also had a look at the laws that were introduced up until 1665 to try and contain the plague, and the things that national and local governments were doing to try and stop it from spreading. Now, when we get to the Great Plague, remember that's in 1665. It's when the plague hits London and kills 100,000 people in London alone. And then it spreads across the country and kills thousands more. Now, when this happens, the king at the time is Charles II. And there is, of course, also a parliament. My personal opinion of this is that perhaps the response of the government at this time leaves a little bit to be desired. So the king and his council deal with the plague in the time-honoured way of running away. And this was actually seen as perfectly acceptable if you could afford to do it. Ordinary people, poor people, middling people, they couldn't afford to run away, but rich people could, and they often did. And so does the king, and so does his council. They then, over the course of the next 7 months, while thousands of people are dying in London, have 3 discussions about the plague. And 2 of those are about how they can keep the king safe. Parliament refuses to turn the 1578 plague laws, or plague orders, into laws. It doesn't want to do it. So there's the option of turning the 1578 plague orders and Parliament won't, basically because they don't want to get locked up in their houses themselves if anybody in their house gets the plague. They do pass a law that says that no plague or pest houses can be built near their houses. So Parliament doesn't really contribute a great deal. However, there are a variety of instructions that are issued by the national government during the Great Plague about how to deal with it. So these are as follows. First of all, people are advised to fast regularly. That means go without food to show God how sorry they are, in the hope that he will take away the plague. The streets are instructed to be cleaned regularly. So another broom. And really, a lot of public meetings and really any opportunities where people might be able to get together and possibly pass the plague among themselves are shut down. So this includes public meetings, and fairs, and large funerals, and plays, and bear baiting, which was a kind of sport where you watched a bear fight a lot of dogs and bet on which one would get torn apart first, and any sort of games. Those were all banned, so that people couldn't spread the plagues among themselves. And that's it really. During the plague, the king leaves 9 men in charge of London. 6 flee. People do take other measures to try and contain the plague. So, for example, they believe that the plague is caused by bad smells called miasmata, and that those miasmata might be carried in the fur of cats and dogs. And so one way in which they try to deal with the plague is by killing cats and dogs. They actually kill 200,000 cats, sorry, wrong number, 200,000 cats and 40,000 dogs to try and stop the spread of the plague. They smoke the bedding of plague victims as well to try and get rid of any miasmata from that. So they smoke the bedding. And they have fires on the street corners. They might burn spices or herbs or things to try and make it smell nice, really. Again, to create smoke and to chase away any miasma. They do experience some problems. For one, there aren't enough watchmen. With the number of houses that are being shut up, and when a house got the plague by 1665, they would shut everybody in it. They would put a large red cross on the door, and they would write, "Lord, have mercy on us." I may not fit this on this door. On it. And then they would put a watchman to guard that house and make sure that nobody went in or out. The problem is that there just aren't enough watchmen to watch over the number of houses that have the plague, and that causes a problem. Apparently as well, because people did not like being locked in their houses and they didn't like this law particularly, we've seen that it was controversial. Sometimes they would murder people in their attempts to get away. So apparently 20 watchmen were killed by desperate people fleeing a plague house. And so those are problems. Another problem is that sometimes the watchmen or the women who worked as searchers might actually steal from plague victims as they lay dying. So there was apparently a problem with theft as well. So during the time of the Great Plague, finding ways of dealing with it is problematic, and there's not a whole lot of support really from the national government in this. Very often it's the local authorities doing whatever they can to try and contain the plague. And what they do varies from town to town really. Some towns do more than others. Just to finish up, we're going to have a quick look at some of the things that were introduced in York. Let's get use of my picture out of it. To try and combat the plague. Now, as of 1518, remember, it's the responsibility of the local authorities to deal with the plague, and a lot of them set up pest houses to care for people who have the plague on the outskirts of town where they can be isolated. After 1550, York actually puts watchmen on the bridge over the River Ouse, over the Ouse Bridge, which is shown here, so that they can keep an eye on who's coming and going with the plague. And in the 1550s as well, they've also employed searchers to check for signs of plague, and this is before they had to, because remember that doesn't become a law really until 1578. And they've also started to collect money for the sick. Now, in the 1500s as well, so that's the way in which York tries to deal with the plague. It's quite proactive and it starts to put measures in place quite early on. Also in the 1500s, there are a number of measures taken in York just to keep things clean, to try and reduce miasma and to try and make the city cleaner, because people are starting to make a connection between dirt and filth and disease. So, for example, they have laws that say that pigs should be kept in a sty and they're not allowed to wander the streets. Disappointed pig there. They have a law against dumping your household waste outside before 7 o'clock in the evening. Some sort of rubbish bag there. They have a law that says that overflowing cesspits were the responsibility of the owner and that they should pay for them to be emptied. They fine people for dunghills. So if they make horrible heaps of rubbish and waste anywhere, then they can be fined for that in York. They also get fined if they put human waste in the streets. And every man in York was expected to clean the streets twice a week in front of his house. So York, as well as introducing a number of measures very early on really to combat the plague, is also introducing measures to really cut down on the kind of problem, things that they saw as perhaps causing the plague, things like miasma, and trying to make their environment more hygienic and cleaner, although possibly not very successfully. Now, just as a final point, it's just worth quickly thinking about how ordinary people responded to the plague. Rich people often escaped and went somewhere else. We know that that wasn't always a brilliant solution because it might carry the plague. Apart from that, people often respond in the way that people do. There are records of people responding with great dignity and fortitude. Things like having dignified funerals for their friends and families. Things like caring for their friends and family. Things like taking in orphans. Who had been left without parents because of the plague. And then there are records of communities standing together and supporting each other. However, people are people, and there are also records of people not responding very well. We've seen that watchmen sometimes got killed. Apparently Daniel Defoe wrote about plague victims throwing the plasters from their buboes through the windows of other people's houses to try and spread the plague. There are stories about parents abandoning children because they had the plague and they didn't want to catch it. There are stories about employers kicking apprentices out onto the streets. And those are some interesting stories. You should really, if you get a chance, look into it, because there's a wide variety of reactions to this time. What we can establish is that it was a really terrible time to live through, and that the plague really presented people with significant problems in terms of living their lives.